Welcome to episode 4 of Sussex Sport Weekly. I'm Matt Poll, and this week I'm joined by Brighton and Hove Albion writers Derren Howard and Frankie Elliott. And this week we are joined by returning hero and Crawley Town oracle Mark Dunford. Brighton enjoyed a frustrating afternoon at home to Fulham on Saturday. Roberto De Zerbi was sent off after the game as Albion fell to a 1-0 defeat to their unlikely European rivals. Brighton probably would have felt aggrieved not to take anything from the game after dominating possession and seeing 2 goals ruled out. This week, the Seagulls turned their attention to the FA Cup with a 5th round trip to Championship side Stoke City on Tuesday evening, and we'll be discussing how that may go. Meanwhile, Crawley Town dropped in the relegation places after a 1-0 defeat at league leaders Leyton Orient, but they are just 1 point behind place above Hartlepool United with 3 games in hand. We will be discussed later on whether or not it's all doom and gloom for the Reds. But first, we'll start with Brighton and their defeat to Fulham. By the sounds of it, Roberto De Zerbi must have walked under a ladder and had multiple black cats cross his path on the way to the Annex on Saturday. How on earth did Albion not manage to win that game, Derren?
Yes, it was very frustrating. Fulham seemed to be proving something of a bogey team for Brighton at the moment, especially this season. But I think if they look at it, if they come away and analyse it, it's kind of difficult to criticise them after that, aside from the finishing. Because Brighton actually played, they played very well. They played Fulham off the park in sort of most positions. As you say, they completely dominated the ball. They had more shots, XG, basically every stat in the book apart from the one, that mattered the most, really. As Fulham sort of went towards the end and scored with a late sucker punch. But if you don't take your chances, that's always the danger, unfortunately. But Brighton were going all out in the final stages. They were pushing men forward. It was just sort of 2 at the back sometimes as they were going for the winner, and it left gaps at the back. And that's something that Fulham, with the players they have from the bench, they exploited it well. To be fair to them. Can you blame? I don't know. Can you blame De Zerbi for that? I don't think so. He was going for the win, and probably rightly so. You'd want to see Brighton at home, really going for the win until the 95th, 96th minute. But it is a blow, especially for their European hopes, and Fulham are challenging for that as well. And they should have had 6 points from the last 2, really, with Palace, and now they've just got the 1 point to show. So, which was probably a reason for De Zerbi's frustration at the end when, he got his red card in the tunnel.
Derren alluded it to there, Frankie, but does it kind of show how far Brighton have come as a Premier League club? Not only are we talking about them potentially in the mix for Europe, but they're kind of ruined the fact that they only have taken 1 point from games against Fulham and Crystal Palace.
I think that's down to De Zerbi. I have to say, I think we look at the last 2 games in particular, and fans are very, very disappointed despite the good performance. The reason for that is because they've employed a manager that's demanding of them to get into these European places. They've not shied away from it. They're certainly not scared of it. As Derren alluded to there, they're going for a win when they could have comfortably taken a point against a very, very decent Fulham side. The main issue for Brighton at the moment is in the last 3 games, they've only scored 2 goals. And the main reason for that is they're now, because of their exceptional team that they've put together, teams of the same ilk as them, the Palaces, Bournemouths and Fulhams of the league, they're now sitting back and defending against them. They're playing them like a top 6 team. I think Brighton have been slightly shocked by this, that this happened so quickly. And that's why instead of scoring 9 goals in 3 games, as we saw in January, they've scored just 2. So that's a problem they'll need to unstick. I'm sure De Zerbi is more than prepared to unstick it. But it's a testament to his management, his ambition, that they've come away from these 3 games with just 1 win and a draw and been incredibly disappointed by it.
Yeah, well, Albion's performance in front of goal at Fulham kind of harked back to the early days under Graham Potter, where they found goals incredibly difficult to come by. Having looked at recent transfer rumours as well, it never seems that Brighton are linked with the centre forward. It's always a holding midfielder or a winger. Is that kind of a blind spot for Brighton, Derren? Is their ability to look for a 20-goal a season striker kind of holding them back at this stage? I mean, you've got Evan Ferguson, but he's been brought into the future, and it's probably a little bit too unfair to put that amount of pressure on a man who's, I think he's just 18, isn't he?
He is 18. He's had an impressive start to his Premier League career, and And I think going through, perhaps looking at next season, he is a striker that Brighton could, look towards to be becoming that 20 goal striker, and probably, a physical presence and a strike with an eye for goal that they've lacked since Glenn Murray was in his prime, to be honest. So I think Ferguson is a player that they do, they are quite excited about. They do think highly of. And if he can get, 15, 20 goals a season, that's going to save them an absolute, fortune, because you talk about a 20-goal striker, but how many of them are there around? How much are they going to cost to, to bring in someone of that ilk? You look at sort of what West Ham have done. They've bought Danny Ings, who has, some fans in the past have said, all Brighton need is a Danny Ings, but it's very difficult to find these type of players. And what Brighton have tried to do is think, if you can get 10 from Matoma, 10 from Solly March, and then Welbeck can chip in with 10. Hopefully Ferguson next year can chip in with 10, and that's quite a good way of looking at it almost, and perhaps a more cost-effective way of doing it as well, rather than spending 30-40 million on this 20-goal striker. So yeah, I think that's where they're at. But I think quite rightly they are quite excited about what Ferguson can bring going forward.
Although it may seem cost effective, do you think that way of them scoring goals will be sustainable in the long run, Frankie?
I think it's the modern way. As Derren alluded to there, in the last 5 years in the Premier League, there's only been 9 players that have scored 20 or more goals in the Premier League, and only 2 of them have come from outside the top 6. So we're talking about an incredibly rare breed of player that is able to score these amount of goals. And even at the highest level, if we look at the City and Liverpool teams, their biggest strength has been the goals from wide areas. You look at that brilliant City team that got 100 points, Sane and Sterling, both chipped in with 15 plus goals. And then Jurgen Klopp's greatest Liverpool team, Salah and Mane in the wide areas. So I think that is the blueprint, even at the highest level, but certainly for teams outside the top 6, because the 20-goal a season striker, as Derren said, is a bit of a myth. But they do have the players to do it now, I believe, in Matoma and March. They certainly are getting into the areas to score the 10-plus goals that Albion will need to challenge at the top half of the table. But it's doing it now. I think the blueprint is there. I think the quality is there. It's just the execution is the important part now.
As you mentioned earlier, as Frankie mentioned earlier, Roberto De Zerbi has been rightly praised for the work that he's done at Brighton. And this week he's been linked with, I think it was Tottenham, Roma, AC Milan, Inter and Juventus. So big European names there. Frankie and Derren, can you see De Zerbi potentially leaving at the end of the season, or does he need to look at a certain Mr. G. Potter to know that the grass isn't necessarily always greener away from Brighton?
Yeah, well, I think it's... I think he's got unfinished business at Brighton still, and it's not a surprise. He's an Italian coach, and he's doing very well in the Premier League. And when the top jobs in Italy do crop up, I think it's something that Brighton are going to have to get used to. That he's going to be, linked to some of these big clubs in the Serie A. He has mentioned previously he would like to return there and manage, but as it stands at the moment, I think Brighton will be happy to see him stay. And he seems very happy at Brighton as well at the moment. His English is getting better and better every week. He seems to be enjoying, other than the standard of refereeing, he seems to be enjoying his time in the Premier League and at Brighton as well. And the feeling's mutual. So I can't, you never know, but I can't see it changing too quickly. And I went back to when Potter left for Chelsea, they got De Zerbi in. So Brighton are always looking, so who the next manager could be, because if you look at the average reign of Premier League managers, it's very short. So the clubs have to always have an idea of who's going to be next in the queue. So no doubt Brighton are already looking should the worst happen. But I would, if you'd take a bet on it, I would think De Zerbi will be there for next season. But hopefully he'll get a bit of backing in with players as well. If Caicedo and McAllister leave, he would want some of that money to be reinvested back into the team on players that he would want and trust.
Yes, I was going to say, Frankie, playing devil's advocate here. Say, for example, the players that Derren mentioned there all did leave. Do you think De Zerbi might think, Or is there much point in me sticking around anymore? Or do you think he would be up for a kind of a rebuilding job at Brighton?
Well, I think the main thing that will keep De Zerbi at Brighton at the moment is he's actually not really got going yet. He hasn't had a full pre-season. He hasn't really had any signings that he has requested, which I believe will be a big part of the transfer policy in the summer, especially about how the way that De Zerbi plays football and the only way he likes to play football. So I feel that the way he's been speaking this season is this is sort of the main aim is, regardless of where they finish in the table or how well they do in the FA Cup, the most important thing is that the Brighton players play his style of football well. That's why I've seen in many games so far the results, he's almost been not too bothered by the defeats or the draws, because he's been more interested in how they've played and if they've played his way. So I think that's the main reason that De Zerbi would stay, is that, well, I haven't even got going here. I haven't even shown what my Brighton team can do. But that being said, he'll also know that the top jobs, I'm sure he's dreamed of, the AC Milans, the Juventus jobs, they don't come around very often, especially for managers from teams outside the big clubs. So that pool is always going to be there, and Brighton can't really stop that. But I believe their best way of keeping him happy is by bringing in players that suit his style, because I feel next season he will want to be, again, challenging for the top 6, top 8 places.
Looking to head to next week, Albion visit Stoke City in the Cup, beat them just 2 games away from Wembley final. Would you say, Frankie, that Brighton genuinely have a chance of getting to Wembley and potentially lifting the FA Cup this season?
I really do. I really, really do. I think De Zerbi's taking this competition very, very seriously. He is incredibly annoyed by the fact they got knocked out by Charlton in the EFL Cup early this year. I was expecting him to show little interest in that competition, hence why they may have lost. But for weeks on end, and especially in the FA Cup pre-match press conferences, he brings up the fact that the Charlton game is something that frustrates him and angers him. I think he sees it as a way into playing European football next year, and he sees it as an opportunity at success. He's a very ambitious guy. If you look at the draw, there's only 3 of the big 6 left in the competition. That's a massive opportunity for Brighton. And if say United and City get through and they draw each other, that takes one of them out again going forward. Playing Stoke, again, Brighton are favourites, but you'd hope, and I think they would have learned their lesson from the Charlton last 16 game they played just before Christmas in the EFL Cup, that they can't take these games lightly. They need to apply it with the same intensity that they do if they played a Big 6 Premier League game.
Going on a different tact. Today, the government announced English football's new independent regulator, and this comes off the back of a fan-led review which took place last year. Derren, you've written an incredibly detailed explanation on our website, sussexsport.co.uk. Can you briefly, if possible, sum up what this new plan means for Premier League clubs like Brighton and also for Football League clubs like Crawley Town?
Yeah. Well, like you say, I think it sort of covers 5 main points really that the white paper's looking at, and just briefly, they're sort of stopping English clubs from, helping to try and prevent English clubs from joining these competitions, like the closed shops competitions, which are sort of, well, they've stated it as they're judged to harm the domestic game, i.e. the European Super League that was muted previously. So it's coming in place to try and prevent these competitions where there's no relegation, no promotion. So what they see as unfair progress of the game by the elite. So they're trying to control that more. And also they're looking at trying to prevent the failings of sort of financial failings, as we saw at clubs like Bury and Macclesfield, so that how the money filters down the pyramid from the Premier League is a key part of what they're looking at. And that's going to be a very contentious issue, because the Premier League, they are this huge money generating machine. Ideally, if you'd probably ask most of the chairman and most of the financial people in the Premier League, they're saying, well, we generate it, we should keep it. But this white paper is saying no, it's not fair. It needs to be distributed down the pyramid. So coming up with a figure which they all going to agree on is going to be pretty tricky. And this is where this paper can, or these regulations can come in and decide on that. Another thing they're looking at is a more stringent sort of owners and directors test to protect clubs and fans. Again, quite how that will be implemented is another way to look at. Will they get involved in, say, for instance, a Qatari takeover or the potential Qatari takeover of Manchester United, and would have they intervened in the Saudi takeover of Newcastle as well? There's lots of sort of human rights issues around that. So how far will they delve into that? And what I found as well, most interestingly for Brighton, is that they're looking at sort of the visa systems for young players coming in. So since Brexit, English clubs haven't been able to sign under 18 players from overseas. And for a club like Brighton, who search the planet for the best players, young players, it's extremely important. And I'm sure Tony Bloom and Paul Barber will be keeping a very close eye on that in particular, because if you can find the right player at the right age, it can save clubs tens of millions, tens and tens of millions. And then in the likes of, if you look at Caicedo, McAllister, their value can then reach heights of 70 million plus. So if a team can unearth 2 or 3 players like that every 5, 6, 7 years or so, it makes a huge impact on how the club is run. So yeah, purely from a financial aspect, the more younger players Albion are able to get hold of it, and their army of scouts are able to access, I'd say the better it would be for them. So I think they'll be keeping a very close eye on that rule in particular.
Moving on to Crawley Town, they dropped into the relegation zone following Saturday's 1-0 defeat at Leyton Orient. On paper, a slender loss to a team that are top of League Two by 13 points, I think. Doesn't seem too bad. But apparently fans very much vented their frustrations at the Crawley Town players at Brisbane Road over the weekend. Mr. Dunford, is it really all doom and gloom at Crawley Town?
Well, if you listen and read a lot of some of the Crawley Town fans, yes, it is all doom and gloom. But, I mean, yeah, like you say, on paper, a 1-0 defeat at Leyton Orient doesn't seem too bad. There's better teams higher in the league that have had bigger defeats to Leyton Orient this year. And also, I mean, previously they lost 2-1 to Stockport. Again, Stockport were 5th. So, on paper, they're both away from home. They weren't games Crawley were expected to win, but I know Scott Lindsay wants to win every game, and he needs to start winning games. But yeah, it's the first time this weekend I think that we've seen the fans turn on the players, which is interesting. Steve Leake, one of our columnists in the paper and a lifelong Crawley fan since the 50s, I think he actually confronted some fans because it's not the players they should be having a go at. Yes, they've got every right to have a go at the owners, Wagme United. They pay their money. They've seen what's happened at the club. And yeah, they've got every right. And he said, save all the moaning before and after the game, aim it at Wagme. But during the game, cheer on the players, support the players best you can. Because once you turn on the players, what are the players going to start thinking? But yeah, I think we're coming on to it, but they've got Carlisle this weekend. They're at home. I think the fans will get behind the players. But the most notable thing on Saturday, actually, was I think it's the first post-match interview we've seen with a Crawley manager, certainly in the last 3 or 4 seasons, where they haven't thanked the supporting fans. And whether that's because I think they directed some of their anger at Scott Lindsay, and whether that was a conscious thing from the interviewer from the club and that, but he didn't mention the fans at all. And it's quite a big thing, I think, because it's quite a staple of a post-match interview away from home, and you thank the travelling fans. So, yeah, it was interesting to see that. So it does seem rather negative at Crawley at the moment. But midweek we saw they didn't play, but Hartlepool and Rochdale both lost, which was a big thing for Crawley, and they've now got 4 games in hand over those teams. I'm sure Scott Lindsay would rather have the points, but 4 games in hand is a lot of ground to catch up on.
Wagme United have been quite radio silent in recent weeks. Do you think now that Crawley are in the relegation zone, they need to make a statement, or will that not solve anything at this stage?
I don't think it will solve anything at this stage, because I don't think the fans believe anything that Wagme United say at the moment. So I think what needs to happen is results get better. I do believe there's going to be a fans forum in the next month but that won't be with Preston or anyone like that. But Chris Galley will be there, the director of football and the interim CEO, and Scott Lindsay. So I mean, all the fans care about is that their club is going to survive, one, which I think it will. WAGMI have money, and that's not a problem. How they spend that money and what they do behind the scenes is a whole different conversation. But yeah, I think the fans just need to see the club winning, and they need to support Chris Galley and what he's trying to do at the club, because him and Scott Lindsay have both said to me on the record that there needs to be a change of culture at the club. We know, obviously, what's happened with the previous manager, etc. There seems to be a lot of players connected with the previous manager who have left the club. So, and I think Scott Lindsay, it was a word he used a few times in one interview I did with him. He said, the club has been loose at Crawley Town. What that exactly means, I don't know. So he's obviously trying to tighten things up, get the discipline going, and then hopefully things will improve. But the fans just need to get behind them. So, yeah, regarding WAGMI, I mean, I think they do need to be a little bit more present. They were at the beginning. They were very transparent. They were at games. Preston Johnson's obviously had his own issues with illness and that, and he's obviously had a lot of treatment and stuff, which I think, from what I understand, he's come on the other side of. But we all know that takes a lot out of someone. So, but there's Eben Smith, who has been more of the silent partner, and all the other people involved in WAGMI United, who I don't think that's ever been fully clarified. But there needs to be some more visibility from them, I think.
Crawley have got a bumper March due to postponements and rearranged games. And during next month, I think they've got 7 games. 2 of those are against relegation rivals Harrogate and Rochdale, which will both be at Broadfield Stadium. How massive is next month going to be for Crawley Town, Mark? And will it be a season-defining month, or is it a bit too dramatic to call it that at this stage?
I don't think it is, to be honest, because, I mean, if it was in the Championship or League One, you're just dropping down to another. But this, it could mean they drop out of the Football League, and we all know how hard it is to get back from the National League back up. And we've seen this. I mean, if you look at the National League now, it is a league full of former league teams, and they're all struggling to get back up. But, I mean, March is an important month for any team, I think. But for Crawley right now, because it's, as I mentioned earlier, they've got 4 games in hand over all their rivals, or a lot of their rivals. It's a huge month. It really is. And 4 of those 7 games are at home, and 2 of them are against, as you've said, is it Harrogate and Rochdale? So, and the club have announced this week that they've making it two games for £2, so you can go and see both those games for £2. So they obviously want to get the fans in. They want to get the fans behind them. But if they don't pick up at least 3 wins from those four home games, because at the moment it just doesn't look like they're going to get any points away from home, and they've got the likes of Northampton in March as well, who are doing really well. Crawley have actually got quite a good record at Northampton. I remember Tony Craig scoring a brilliant last-minute winner there a couple of seasons back. But I think, yeah, it is a season-defining month for them, and those 4 home games are absolutely vital. They've got to win those, and yeah, they've got I think it's 3 of their 4 games in hand in March as well, against Grimsby and Doncaster. So it's a huge month, and yeah, they've got to pick up wins. Otherwise, it is going to start looking quite harsh for them.
Well, looking at the here and now, Mark, they've got 3rd place Carlisle at home on Saturday before making a long midweek trip to mid-table Tranmere. How do you see them going for Crawley?
I think Saturday will be positive. They do always seem to manage to pull out a big performance against a higher placed club. I think Carlisle are 3rd at the moment.
Yes.
So, yeah, they always seem to pull it off. They've done it before. They've beaten Swindon at home when they were high flyers. Forest Green last season, I remember they pulled off a big win. So I think they can do it at home. Tranmere away, like I said, the Crawley away. It looks a big struggle for them. They are capable of pulling out big performances against the bigger sides. So if they can come away with at least 2 points, or at least 3 points, they want to win Saturday. But if they can come out with 4 points, then it'll be a really good week for Crawley Town.
Before we move on to Brighton and Crawley score predictions, it was announced this morning being Thursday, 23rd of February, that legendary commentator John Motson who had a 50-year career with the BBC and commentated numerous World Cups and FA Cup finals, died at the age of 77. Obviously, it's dreadfully sad news. I was just wondering if any of you three had any particularly fond memories of John Motson that particularly stand out in your mind.
I'm happy to start off with this one. John Motson is a voice of the generation of football when I grew up. Everything I watched was commentated by John Motson. And I think the most famous one for me was the 1990 World Cup when Gascoigne, the tears of Gascoigne, and he just said, oh dear me, he's going to be out of the World Cup final if we get there. Here's a moment that almost brings tears to his eyes. And I think it brought tears to a lot of people's eyes. Mm. And it's sort of, And just when he commentated on when England beat Germany 5-1, praising Michael Owen for his hat-trick. And when Liverpool lost to Wimbledon in the 1988 FA Cup, the crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club. I think that's goes down in sort of football history. But he did have his gaffes as well, didn't he? And there was a couple of quite famous ones. I thought I remembered them, but I had to look them up. But there's one where he said he's got the taste of Wembley in his nostrils, which is quite nice. You couldn't count the number of moves Alan Ball made. I counted 4 and possibly 5, which was quite good. But my favourite one, for those of you watching in black and white, Spurs are in the all yellow strip. He is an absolute legend, and following Dickie Davis this week as well. So
yes,
it's a sad week for sport commentary and punditry sort of thing. So that's my memories of Motti.
Yeah, for me, as following on from Mark, as someone who grew up without having Sky or BT as a young kid, John Motson was my voice of football, and certainly soundtracked all of my young footballing memories. Match of the day, FA Cup, World Cup, the Euros. They were all his enthusiasm and passion for every game, whether it be the World Cup final or the third round of the FA Cup, was just inspiring and enthralling. I remember being asked a lot who my favourite player was as a kid, and I have to say, I was just idolising John Motson. I really was. I remember from a very young age I wanted to become a commentator and a sports journalist, and it was because of him. That, like I say, that passion, that enthusiasm, and that attention to detail for everything, and giving everything its just desserts, not just, like I say, the World Cup final, but a first round conference team playing against the League One opposition. If that striker had scored 30 goals in that league, he would give him every sort of stat and praise he possibly could. And I had to say I wouldn't be doing what I do or would have pursued what I would have done without having John Motson. So incredibly sad, but an incredible role model and probably the best sports football commentator we'll ever see.
Yeah, absolutely, Frankie. Yeah, it was his enthusiasm and passion for the role that really came through, and you could just tell he was a really thorough broadcaster, did his research, proper journalist, and then delivered it with such passion. And it'd just be so engaging, and he was just quite an iconic figure. He was always in the sheepskin coat and always in there. So yeah, very very sad news, but he had a great career, and I think he, made an impact on a number of people, and you can't ask for much more than that, really.
Yeah, I've got vague recollection. I think it was the 2002 World Cup group stage game against Argentina, which kicked off at about midday. And I vaguely remember for the first quarter of an hour, John Motson kept on talking about what he wanted for lunch or something like that. It was very odd idiosyncrasies, but yeah, he'll be sorely missed, and he's a true giant of the game. But very, very quickly to round things off, Stoke v Brighton in the FA Cup. Derren, how do you see that going?
Yeah, so Frankie said earlier, I think Brighton will take it very seriously. Big chance to win a competition. They won't have the likes of Casado, McAllister. March is playing well, forever. March is playing so well at the top of his game. Matoma's in form. So, yeah, I think they're really going to go for it. And I can see them getting the job done at Stoke. So I'll go for a 3-1.
Frankie?
Yeah, I think Brighton are going to win. I think they are still going to find it a struggle. Going to Stoke is a difficult place to go, as we all know, and will certainly be with an FA Cup tie, which would, for Stoke in the FA Cup with their poor championship season, the quarterfinal could really save their season. So I'm actually going to go for a Brighton win on penalties. I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw in the game and a Brighton win on penalties.
Mark Dunford, what are you going for?
I think, like you said, De Zerbi's taken it so seriously this year. I can't see anything other than a Brighton win. and I'll go 2-1. I think it'll be tight, but I think Brighton will win.
Yep, the same question to you. Crawley at home to Carlisle. What are you going for? And then their midweek game at Tranmere. What you feeling this week?
I'm going for that. I think they'll win on Saturday, but I think it'll be tight. Scott Lindsay's yet to keep a clean sheet as Crawley Town manager, so I think it will be 2-1. Dom Telford, he's going to step up this week. He came with such a fanfare. He hasn't fully delivered, but I think this is his week. 2-1, and Telford to get both. And then Tranmere, I'm going to be positive. I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw.
Derren, Carlisle and Tranmere for Crawley.
Yeah, I think at home, I think they just need a win, hook or by crook, no matter how they play, how they do it. So I think they could scrape to a 1-0 victory at home, and then maybe on the road, like you say, they haven't played that well, have they, on the road. So yeah, I'd say a win at home, and then at Tranmere, perhaps a 1-0 reverse.
Frankie, how optimistic are you this week about Crawley Town's chances?
I think this Saturday, as Mark said, at home, with a fired-up crowd, if they can get that sort of negative energy as it is, if they can get that actually with a strong start, that sort of energy can turn quite positive quite quickly. So with that in mind, I think they might get a 1-1 draw against a very well-drilled Carlisle side. And then away from home is still an issue, especially Tranmere. That's a long way to go. So I'm going to go for a 2-0 Tranmere win on that one.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much for your conversation this week, chaps. Make sure to visit sussexworld.co.uk/sport for all the latest sports news and views. And we will be back next week.